Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited about this presentation, this session that we're doing. It's a topic that we've been very passionate about here at OMX, which is about driving more local content from procurements, particularly to Canadian companies and SMEs across Canada, but also to Aboriginal-owned businesses. So very fortunate to have Avocent, which is a globally renowned consulting company based in Washington, been taking the lead with the government to provide these reports and feedback, and they're out seeking feedback across Canada. They've been doing meetings all over Canada over the last few weeks to get feedback from the people that this will really impact. So thank you very much for joining. I'm going to invite Doug Berenson from Avocent to go over the presentation and the slides, and just want to encourage all of you to put in any questions through the GoToWebinar feature there. Just any questions or any open-ended comments or feedback. Otherwise, we'll also be sending around an email at the end with a survey and the open forum for you to also provide further feedback. I think it's really important timing to make sure that everyone's briefed on this and to actually provide your feedback to ensure that this report is executed and benefits everyone. So again, I'm Nicole from OMX, and we've just been organizing this webinar because we've got really good data on a lot of the stakeholders, and we work with government and government contractors to help them fulfill their local spend and local economic impacts. So we've been very fortunate to work with Avocent on this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug, and I'll be coming back on later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Again, my name is Doug Berenson. I'm a managing director at Avocent. Avocent is a management consulting firm. We're based in Washington, but we have offices in Ottawa and a few other cities around the world. And we work at what we like to describe as the intersection of government and industry. We work in government-driven markets, of which defense is the sort of the obvious centerpiece, because government is the central customer there, and it's for that reason, I think, that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada turned to us to help them think through this question of key industrial capabilities. We've been working on this for some months now on behalf of ICED, but what I'm going to show you really is our opinion and our conclusions, not government policy. It's a point that I'll emphasize again as we go along here. Let me give you a sense of the time frame of the work that we have been doing. We got started with ICED in sort of the latter quarter, if you will, of 2015, looking at this topic of key industrial capabilities. And our work at that time really was focused mainly on looking at how the rest of the world thinks about key industrial capabilities. When Canada looks at how the rest of the world does this, do other countries state particular priorities? And if they do, what do about it? What sorts of tools do they bring to bear to advantage or advance the interests of critical sections of their defense industrial bases? And we reported out some work on that international survey, if you will, in the first quarter of 2016 to government in Ottawa. And since then, we've been working on more of sort of a Canadian-focused version of this. That is to say, what should Canada prioritize on a list of key industrial capabilities from within its defense industrial base, and what should Canada do about it? What should they do with a list once it's settled? We spent the better part of 2016 sort of drafting that list through a lot of analyses that I'll describe in a minute here, and consulting with government, particularly in the latter half of 2016. Since then, since about the late January of this year, we've been engaging with industry and with provinces and territories and academia and now the Aboriginal community to sort of show what we have and solicit feedback. Again, what we're showing you here is our view and our opinion on this, and we're really not going to finalize it until we've had a chance to hear from all these different stakeholders who may have something to say about how this policy wants to move forward. So with that, I'll just sort of speak to my objectives here for this presentation. Again, really, we want to refine a preliminary list of key industrial capabilities, or KICs, as I'll show you in just a few minutes here, to solicit feedback on that list and the question of what should we do with the list. And then from there, Avocent is going to synthesize the perspectives and feedback we receive into a final report, which we owe to the government by the end of March this year. So in just about a month's time. And again, I will take a moment here to re-emphasize that what I'm going to show you is Avocent's opinion, not government policy. You know, I would note that Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada has been extremely supportive of the work that we have been doing on this KICs topic. But what I'm going to show you is our expert opinion, not their policy. So with that, let me offer a little bit of context about key industrial capabilities. And the context really sort of spans both the Canadian scene and in the global context. Many of you may remember that back in 2013, the Jenkins panel reported out its own analysis of the question of how should Canada set defense industrial policy. And among other things, the Jenkins panel in the Canada First report advocated the creation of a list of key industrial capabilities as a way to maximize economic benefits that may flow from defense procurement. Now that panel cited a list of key industrial capabilities, but I think that list was kept very broad and more or less all-inclusive to almost the entirety of Canada's defense industrial base in the interests of getting buy-in on the concept overall. And that's, I think, why Avocent was later brought on by ICED so that we could refine that list of KICs and implement it moving forward. In the conversations that Avocent has had with stakeholders, particularly industry stakeholders in Canada, on the question of key industrial capabilities, one thing has become very clear, and that there really is a thirst for greater clarity on defense industrial policy and how KICs will be applied. And so I think that our work is timely in hopefully providing some transparency in that question. And then obviously all of this is made manifest by the imminent set of big defense programs that Canada is considering moving forward on, or already moving forward on in some cases. So between the Canadian Surface Combatant or the potential acquisition of Super Hornet from Boeing to replace the CF-18, there are large defense investments in the offing that provide an opportunity and a set of tools to move the ball on key industrial capabilities. Now, from a global perspective, it probably bears mentioning some of this as well, because it really has an impact on how Canada behaves and what Canada can expect its defense industry to face in the coming years. For one, you have a far more globalized defense sector now than existed even just a decade ago. There are a number of countries out there that are relatively new to the global defense market, but are acting very strongly and with very strong government backing. You have companies in countries like Turkey and Korea and Israel and Brazil and Poland and many others that were created on the basis of offset credits over the years, and now have become global players in and of themselves. And they are active in the global marketplace with the active support of their governments. And so as Canadian firms go around the world to compete, they are increasingly running into, if you will, peer competitors with the active support of their home governments. And then the last point I would mention here has been an area of great interest for the Canadian government, and that is this question of spillover linkages between traditional defense technologies and broader commercial technologies. Obviously with the innovation agenda, the government is looking to spur economic development in a variety of sectors that can yield economic advantage for the country and its citizens, and I think clearly would like to try and use defense industrial policy to have some of the same effect. And when you look at how defense technology has changed, again, in that last 10 to 15 years, it's easy to see why this is the case. In many cases, defense is informing developments in the commercial world. If you think about areas like cyber and drones, those are technologies that were more or less born in the defense realm. And then it also works the other way around. Defense is increasingly availing itself of innovation and dynamism that's chiefly flowing from commercial sectors, like information technology, for example. So with that context, I'll move forward, and I'm going to define a few terms here before I get too far. As we have gone and briefed this material on key industrial capabilities to various audiences across the country, one question that we've frequently been asked is, well, how do you define a Canadian company or Canadian capabilities? And the answer to that is we're going to define it fairly broadly. We are, for the purposes of this work, we will define a Canadian company as any company with substantial industrial activities in Canada, even if the corporation is headquartered somewhere else. So as long as a company is employing Canadians in actual work, whether that's design or technology development or manufacturing or product sustainment, that's good enough for us in terms of being called a Canadian capability or a Canadian company. Again, if you look across the landscape of the Canadian industrial base, there are many examples of companies whose headquarters are in the United States or the United Kingdom or Germany or wherever have you. We're not going to dwell on that distinction so long as they have actual industrial operations in Canada generating economic activity. Okay, so when we think about key industrial capabilities, we want to be clear on what KICs are intended to do and not intended to do. I'm actually going to start on the right-hand side of this slide and talk about what we don't mean by key industrial capabilities. We think that KICs are not really here to be used to favor only very specific areas of the defense economy and no others. We are not trying to constrain the government to one set of industrial priorities, understanding that the government has a broader innovation agenda than just defense. We are not looking to use KICs to inhibit the use of competition in the Canadian defense marketplace. We've had firms sort of actively look for sole source contracting opportunities, for example, and while there may be a place for that, we are not looking to the list of KICs to make that a universal practice. We are also not looking to use the KICs list to protect industries through unnecessary expenditures or procurements. So just because an industry is maybe listed as a key industrial capability, we are not advocating, for example, that the Department of National Defense start acquiring that stuff even if it doesn't have an active requirement for it. D&D, I think, during our consultations was a little nervous about that, but that's not our intent. Our intent is to let D&D state what its priorities and its appetites are, and really to have KICs focus on how to manage those procurements. And then finally, we don't want to create industries that are not sustainable on their own. We're really looking to advantage Canadian industry and support Canadian industry as it competes on its own by and large. So that begs the question: well, what are KICs for? From our perspective, the central rationale for a list of KICs is to articulate a set of priorities for future growth and investment. Secondly, we really want to use the list of KICs to align and shape government policies in order to channel global capital to support Canadian government objectives. We want to promote transparency and predictability in the application of government policy, including the use of offset policies. We want to generate commercial spillover benefits that can flow from a focused set of priorities as feature in the list of KICs. And finally, we want to reinforce the use of existing clusters in order to drive economic development and innovation over time. I want to emphasize here that KICs is one tool available to the government to support Canadian industry, but it is not the only tool. And I'll touch on this a little bit more as I move forward. So when we had to think of a list of key industrial capabilities, the first question we really needed to ask ourselves was, how do you decide what is key? What's the rationale for deciding what is a critical capability? And it occurred to us that there are several rationales for that. And the list of key industrial capabilities really needs to recognize all of them. First and foremost, I think the list of key industrial capabilities has to identify a set of technology priorities that represent sort of growth opportunities for Canada. So are there industrial sectors and capabilities in Canada that are nascent but have the potential to grow into a much greater role in the national economy? And those may be squarely in the defense realm, or they may have a foot in commercial areas as well. Secondly, the list of KICs needs to recognize that there are already a set of leading Canadian competencies competing in the global marketplace that it is in the government's interests to advantage in some way, to ensure that they continue to compete effectively in the global marketplace, even if it's up to the government to provide a little wind in their sails, if you will. And then thirdly, we wanted to recognize some strategically vital capabilities where the government has an interest, a sovereign interest, in ensuring domestic capacity in times of national emergency. So these are areas where the government does not want to be reliant on foreign sources of supply in times of crisis. So when we thought about how to, if you will, populate those three categories of key industrial capabilities, we started by looking at the entirety of the Canadian defense industrial base. And as we look across the country, we think that the Canadian defense industrial base can be organized and categorized into roughly 60 discrete segments across air, land, maritime, C4I, and space. Now these roughly 58 market categories represent both areas of great strength and areas that are frankly much thinner. You know, there are a handful of categories here where the Canadian capacity may frankly exist only in one program. You know, it may have been set up by a foreign company to retire some obligation, some offset obligation it had. But in other areas, the Canadian capacity is large and varied and technically differentiated, and really robust. And it's the latter, really, that we sort of mainly chose from in populating at least a portion of our list of key industrial capabilities. So again, from these roughly 58 categories will flow our proposed list of key industrial capabilities. So how did we do that? How did we get from that larger list down to a smaller list? Well, the first thing we did was we collected a lot of data on Canadian capacities. And we collected information in a series of categories to ask questions about both the state of the Canadian industrial base and the kind of opportunity that it could face in global markets, and also what are the government's own priorities. So let me talk about various categories and criteria that we looked at. So first we looked at the industrial base itself and measured its strength, if you will. And we measured its strength in a series of categories. So how technically differentiated is it? How many companies are involved? What's the level of employment across the country? How much revenue is generated? Where is that capacity in the supply chain? A series of questions we asked to give us a sense of how distinguished the Canadian industrial base in those dozens of categories is. Secondly, we looked at market demand. So when we look at the global marketplace, the addressable global marketplace, how large a market can Canadian firms legitimately address themselves to? And this gives us a sense of what's the upside opportunity that Canada can look to in terms of economic development. So we looked at the size of the addressable global market, and we set a threshold of $500 million annually for industries to be considered key industrial capabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about that point as I move on here. We also looked at market growth. So, hopefully a key industrial capability can address itself to a growing market as it looks to expand Canadian employment and economic development. And then finally, we looked at government priorities. So what is DND and the Canadian Coast Guard going to acquire over the next 5 years? And the reason that we asked this question is that it occurs to us that government procurements are one of the central tools available to the government to advance the cause of key industrial capabilities. The government can use these procurements to shape contractor behavior in a way that can yield industrial benefits and economic development. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And then lastly here, this question of surety of supply. This really goes to the question of sovereign capacities where that third category of KICs rationale. We had a lot of conversations with folks in the Department of National Defense about their opinion about what really needs to be preserved in Canada as a sovereign strategic capability. And so our opinion there is heavily colored by DND's own views. Now, as we thought about all this information that we collected, we rated it differently. We thought about these criteria differently across these different rationales for criticality. So in the category of pursuing emerging growth opportunities at the top here, really the main issue for us was this question of market growth, because this is all about opportunity. That as the Government of Canada thinks about advantaging Canadian capabilities and companies, really looking to tap into growing markets and the advantages that they can offer to Canadian citizens over time. Secondly, under advantaging leading Canadian competencies, the first question we really asked ourselves was, how distinguished is the Canadian industrial base? How technically differentiated is it? How substantial is it in terms of employment and tax base and things like that? And then finally, under maintaining strategically important capabilities, really the central question for us is this one of surety of supply in terms of DND's opinion on what has to be preserved as a sovereign strategic capability. I don't want to bore you with too much methodology. I've probably already done that. I'll just simply say that we collected a lot of data and organized that to ask these questions in a systematic way across the Canadian industrial landscape in order to generate some, hopefully reasonably rigorous opinions about where there is risk and opportunity that makes various industrial sectors critical or key, if you will. And what we're showing here on this slide is just some of that backup data that we organized in various ways to shape our opinions. And so from that, we get to the list, or at least the provisional list, as we are sort of articulating it right now at this moment in time. So let me just sort of talk about a handful of these categories here that feature on this list and say a few other things about them. The first thing I want to say about this list here, this provisional list, is that while you see many of these labels, and it's easy to imagine the names of famous companies, famous Canadian companies, I want to emphasize that we intend this list to speak not just to the big prime contractor level. Rather, we also intend this list to speak to the supply chain, the Canadian supply chain that serves this overall category. And so our intention is for these capability areas to be relevant to a much broader array of companies and capabilities than just the household names that many people think of in Canada. The second thing I would say here is that definitions are very important here. At the back of this presentation, which will be available to you, we have a written definition for each of these 17 areas. And in some areas, the definition is probably about what you would imagine it is. But in some cases, the definition has some nuance that's important. Either that's because we're defining the category very broadly. We want to take a very broad and expansive view of that category. Or in some cases, we're defining the category much more narrowly. And that's because there may be a particular element of that key industrial capability, or that industrial capability that we think is key, rather than the whole shooting match, if you will. One other thing that I would say, and I'll pick up on this on the slide, is we've gotten a lot of feedback since we've been doing this engagement process about what is not on the list. So we've talked with companies who feel that they are in very distinguished companies and industries in Canada, and that they don't really understand why they don't feature here. And by and large, the answer to that question is that the way in which we set up the criteria and did the analysis that led to these lists set some boundaries for the size of the industry or the size of the market that it can serve. And that's essentially what, that slide doesn't feature here, but I'll make sure that it does in the version that's available to the audience here. But this takeaway point at the bottom of the slide makes this point. If you expanded the list of criteria, the list of KICs would expand also. And we are now in the process of thinking about that question. That did we set the boundaries on the analysis too narrowly, for example? And so should we broaden this list? Now I'm not going to name here some of the categories that we've discussed in this vein, but we have talked with firms in industries that are not represented on this list about rethinking this process, and we're taking that under advisement. I don't want to prejudice where the list may end up, but it's something that we are actively considering at this point. So let me move on from here. and go and address the very important question of what do you do with a list? What about implementation? You know, it's one thing to have a list of key industrial capabilities. It's quite another thing to have some thought on what you would do with that list. And from our perspective, what you would use the list for would differ significantly by what your objectives are in each of these three areas of criticality. So let's start at the top here. You know, under pursuing emerging growth opportunities, it seems to us that the central objective for government is to promote investment in R&D and to develop sort of commercialized presence, to ensure that Canadian capabilities are incorporated into a global supply chain and a commercialized basis. And so from our perspective, that implies that we should use the KICs list to shape government policies in a way that really focus R&D in relevant areas, and that draw on Canadian capabilities in a way that fits them into commercial or global supply chains. Second, under leading Canadian competencies, you know, it seems to us that the government's central objective here is to support continued innovation and continued export success. And so our thought is to use this list to drive the use of Canadian capabilities in Canadian government procurements. Now, I want to be careful to say that we are not advocating that the government mandate that all procurements that involve the Canadian capabilities listed as KICs here automatically serve D&D or Canadian Coast Guard requirements. But we do think that it is legitimate to advantage Canadian capabilities in those procurements. You know, we understand that the Canadian government generally shies away from sole source procurements or Canadian content mandates across the board. But we do advocate advantaging Canadian firms in procurements where relevant. And then finally, toward the bottom here, under maintain strategically important capabilities, ultimately the objective is to ensure that relevant capabilities do persist in Canada into the future. And so what we would advocate here is using the list of key industrial capabilities to truly privilege Canadian capabilities in those areas where it is essential for the government to have a Canadian capacity. This essentially would get to the question of Canadian content mandates and some use of sole source contracting. But in our view, it's legitimate to do that on this narrow front of capabilities given D&D's sovereign strategic interests. So I want to end here with just putting this question of key industrial capabilities in the broader context of Canada's national economic policy. You know, I think that there are a lot of tools available to the government to advantage Canadian companies and capabilities more broadly than just key industrial capabilities. You know, I think that for all, as we've talked with audiences in industry and in government and in academia, it's become clear that there's a concern that with a list of key industrial capabilities, I think people worry sometimes that that's the only way of getting government support if you serve a given industry. And our view is that that ought not be the case. That while it's legitimate, we think, to use key industrial capabilities to have certain focused effects, there are a broader set of tools, and we list some of them on the right-hand side of this slide, that the government can use to advantage Canadian capabilities, including Aboriginal capabilities. And that includes the use of ITB policy, to drive Canadian content and the development of Canadian sources. It can include government-to-government programs to ensure that Canadian firms are present on the ground floor, if you will, of new development activities with foreign governments like the United States or other allied governments. Efforts by the Canadian government to pursue export advantage for Canadian firms, either on their own or as part of global supply chains, and on from there. Again, I think we want to acknowledge, particularly when the government is considering a broader innovation agenda that may span well beyond just defense, that there are this broader array of tools that can be brought to bear beyond the context of key industrial capabilities themselves. So this is my last slide before I will pause and take some questions. Again, this is a preliminary list, as we're showing here. Our mandate from the government is to engage with stakeholders across industry and among the provinces and territories and with academia. We have been doing that now for the better part of a month. We will continue to do that in the coming weeks. Our expectation and our intent, I think, is to consider revisions both to the list of KICs itself. So again, the list I showed you today is not set in concrete. And also consider revisions to how we imagine the list of KICs being used in actual policy terms. We've had some very detailed and specific thoughts on that level beyond the broader thoughts that I've shared with you today. But even those broad thoughts, I think, are subject to revision based on the feedback that we're getting from various interlocutors across the country. Now, we owe a final report to our clients in Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada at the very end of March. Probably will take a week or 10 days to write our report toward the end of that month. But between now and then, we are open to receiving feedback from people and taking questions. And so with that, I will shut up for a moment and see if we have any questions.
Nicole, did you have a couple of questions that you wanted to ask the Avison team?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes especially to the community that's on this call, I think the question we always get is, what does this really mean for me and my business? Sure, there might be some shifts and changes at the government policy level. We know that it's not happening immediately. We know this is all just advice. But when it really comes down to what should you do if you're a small business in Canada, what should you do for an Aboriginal-owned business, what does this really mean to you? I mean, without just answering my own question, I think I would say that I think it's critical that the dialogue continues. I think that most Canadian SMEs are living lower in supply chains, so they're lower at a tier, so all they know is that their customers all of a sudden get a prerogative to start buying more, which benefits them. I think there's some capacity building that needs to be done across Canada as well to fit some of these specific requirements. I mean, we can't just go from zero to everything overnight. So there's a lot of sort of topics here, but overall, I think it's been really great that there's a lot of engagement, and my biggest thing is we want to make sure that everybody who are on the call today, respond to the feedback form and go online and actually put your official feedback in there so that it does gets into the package. So I think that's the key, that there's an open dialogue, that this feedback continues to come, and then when we really look at what does this really mean to me as a supplier of some component or part within this chain, I'm not sure if you're ever going to see the actual impact, but that this is happening at a higher level. So maybe Doug, we don't have any specific questions on the webinar here that have come through, so I think just encouraging the feedback, and if you have any maybe final comments on how this will really impact people on the call, that might be good.
Yeah, no, so Nicole, I think everything you said, I think is true, and I think is advice well taken. I would say that a few things. One is, At a certain level, I'm not sure that folks who are operating at relatively sort of fundamental, basic levels of the supply chain will feel much difference at all. I think that my take on this is that the government will use this revised policy, I think, to shape how it deals with companies sort of closer to the pointy end of the spear, as they say. So companies not just at the top of the supply chain, but within a level or two down as well, to really shape how they behave. To drive investment from those firms, and sourcing behavior from those firms in a more active and focused way. And I would hope that has a positive effect on the companies and communities listening in on this call now. I mean, I would think that however this list finalizes, it would be useful, I think, for these communities to think about where in Canada these capabilities are and are focused, and to really forge the closest ties with those kinds of companies as possible. So hopefully in that way it may make your outreach efforts maybe a little bit easier, because you'll have a clear sense of who is advantaged, or who is, I guess that's the word I would use, who is advantaged at those higher levels of the supply chain, understanding that they are then going to have to turn around and make good on that advantage by sourcing from broader Canadian capabilities, including Aboriginal capabilities, and making various other ITB commitments, and knowing where to go to make good on those commitments. Where there are communities well situated to work with them, I think will continue to be something that's very important.
I completely agree. So I think that about wraps it up. We're 10 to 3 here, so we're pretty in line. I think the number one thing is just everyone on the call, please engage. You'll be getting an email very shortly from our team with a link, and please engage online to make sure you get your thoughts in. And otherwise, you should all know how to reach us directly. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you all. Nicole and OMX, thank you very much for your help in setting this up. Yes, and I would absolutely advocate that if anybody has questions or comments, please, by all means, do go to the feedback page and let us know.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.